The year is 1881. The wind, a hot and tireless thing, blew red dust through Esperanza Gulch. It was a fine, gritty powder that settled on everything, turning the world a uniform shade of rust. It coated the tongues of men and livestock, worked its way through the cracks in window frames, and gathered in silent drifts against the horse troughs. The people of the town, what few there were, had learned to live with it. They barred their doors not against intruders, but against the land itself. Through the hazy, sun-bleached glass of the general store and the saloon, life moved in muted shapes, slowed by the oppressive heat. Elias Rourke rode toward his ranch, Dry Willow. He was a silhouette against the endless, shimmering sky, a man who seemed carved from the same hard earth he worked. The creak of his saddle was a familiar, rhythmic complaint, a sound that had replaced conversation in his life. His duster, a heavy canvas garment the color of dried mud, was frayed at the cuffs and collar, whipped thin by 1,000 such winds. His face, shaded by the brim of a sweat-stained hat, was a map of hardship. There were lines etched around his eyes from squinting into the sun, and a grim set to his mouth that had long since become permanent. His eyes, deep-set and shadowed, held the hollowed-out look of a man who had spent too many nights staring into the dark, listening for the sound of a coyote or the telltale trickle of a failing well. The night before had been another vigil by the well at Dry Willow. His ear pressed to the cool stone, trying to gauge the depth of the water by sound alone. It was a fool's task, but it was all he had. He was a man who carried silence like a shroud. In Esperanza Gulch, silence was a vacuum that gossip rushed to fill. The whispers followed Elias like his own shadow. Bad luck follows that man. They'd mutter over lukewarm beer in the saloon. Anything he touches turns to dust. They had proof of a sort. His wife, Mary, taken by a fever during the great drought of '76, her body as parched as the cracked creek bed behind their home. His herd, once the finest in the valley, decimated by a grass fire 2 years later. The memory of their panicked bellows still a phantom on the wind. The townsfolk saw it as a curse, a darkness that clung to Rourke. They didn't see the man who had worked his hands raw trying to dig a deeper well, who had ridden into the heart of the fire until his own skin blistered, trying to turn the stampede. They saw only the outcome. A man who loves Rourke is a man who loves sorrow, the preacher's wife had once declared, and the sentiment had stuck, becoming as much a part of the local lore as the story of the town's founding. A new sound had recently joined the wind's constant sigh, the distant, mournful wail of a train whistle. The Silver Meridian Railroad was pushing west, a relentless iron snake carving its way through the landscape. To some, it was the sound of progress, of mail arriving on time and goods from the east. To men like Elias, it was the sound of a predator. The railroad needed water for its steam engines, vast quantities of it. They had agents, smooth-talking men in city suits, who were buying up land with access to water, offering prices that were just high enough to be tempting and just low enough to be an insult. Dry Willow, with its deep, reliable well, was the last independent water source in the gulch. It was the linchpin, the one piece that stood between the Silver Meridian and total control of the valley. Elias knew they were watching him, waiting for him to fail, waiting for the drought or the bank to finally break him so they could pick the bones of his ranch for pennies on the dollar. While the town squinted against the dust and whispered its judgments, Lila Quinn saw things differently. She saw light and shadow, composition and character, a traveling photographer and part-time tutor. She was a recent and curious addition to Esperanza Gulch. She stood now on the wooden porch of the saloon, a place women of her standing were meant to hurry past, not occupy. Her camera, a handsome box of polished mahogany and brass fittings, sat atop a sturdy tripod. It was her anchor in a world that was constantly shifting. While others saw a dusty, grim-faced rancher, Lila saw the hard line of a jaw, the stoic set of shoulders against a vast, unforgiving landscape. Her eyes, the color of a stormy sky, missed nothing. They followed Elias Rourke's slow progress down the main street with the focused intensity of a hawk circling its prey. She wasn't interested in the rumors. She was interested in the truth etched on the man's face. The lazy afternoon stillness was shattered by a sharp crack, like a rifle shot, followed by the groan of tortured wood. A heavy freight wagon, overloaded with supplies for the mining camp to the north, had snapped its rear axle square in the middle of the street. The massive wagon lurched violently, its cargo shifting with a sickening crash. Barrels of flour and sacks of beans tumbled onto the dusty ground. But Lila's attention was fixed on a large, padlocked chest that slid precariously toward the edge. It contained her silver-coated glass plates, the fragile heart of her craft, painstakingly prepared and worth more to her than anything else on the wagon. Without a second thought, she moved. While the driver cursed and the saloon doors creaked open as men came to watch the spectacle, Lila darted off the porch. She was not a large woman, but she moved with a wiry, determined grace. She reached the wagon just as the heavy chest tipped over the edge. She threw her shoulder against it, her boots sliding in the thick dust, her muscles straining to slow its descent. Elias had seen the whole thing. He reacted with the pure instinct of a man accustomed to crisis. A slight pressure from his knees, a soft word, and his horse, a steady buckskin named Dust, sidestepped with perfect obedience. In 3 long strides, they were beside the crippled wagon. Elias swung out of the saddle before the horse had even come to a full stop. He didn't rush. His movements were economical and powerful. He grabbed the iron-banded corner of the chest just as Lila's strength was about to give way. His grip was sure, his presence a solid wall of force. Together, they wrestled the heavy box away from the broken wheel and lowered it gently to the ground. For a moment, they stood there, breathing heavily in the swirling dust. A fine sheen of sweat glistened on Lila's brow, tracing a clean line through the film of red grit on her skin. Elias's knuckles were white where he gripped the wagon's side rail, steadying himself. The scent of hot metal, horse sweat, and her faint, clean scent of soap and photographic chemicals filled the small space between them. The chest of glass plates was safe. The silence that followed was broken only by the panting of the wagon driver and the soft snort of Elias's horse. "Thank you," Lila said. Her voice was steady, surprisingly calm amidst the chaos. It was a voice that held no room for hysterics, a practical, even tone that seemed to belong to a much older person. From inside the saloon, a low murmur rippled through the onlookers. "See that Rourke?" The name was spoken like a warning. "That poor girl. She'll have nothing but trouble now." The words were just loud enough to carry on the hot air, sharp and clear as broken glass. Elias heard them. He had always heard them. He gave Lila a short, almost imperceptible nod, a gesture of acknowledgement that was as much a dismissal as it was a reply. He didn't offer further help or another word. His part was done. He turned, swinging himself back into the saddle with a fluid motion that belied his weariness. He gathered the reins, his gaze already fixed on the long, dusty road leading to Dry Willow. As he turned the horse, a sharp, familiar ache pulsed in his left shoulder. It was an old burn scar, a puckered, angry map of skin from the day of the Great Fire. It always tightened when he was tired or when the past pressed too close. Right now, it felt like a hot coal beneath his shirt. The whispers from the saloon, Lila's steady gaze, the memory of his own strength failing against an unstoppable force, it all came together in that single point of pain. The fire that had taken his herd had never truly gone out. It still smoldered inside him, a constant, burning reminder of all he had lost, and all he still stood to lose. The late afternoon sun slanted low across the valley, painting the dust devils in shades of orange and gold. The wind, which had blown hot and steady from the south all day, began to shift. It now came in hesitant gusts from the west, carrying with it a new scent, something different from the usual smell of dry earth and sun-baked creosote. It was a thin, acrid smell, the ghost of smoke from a distant grass fire, inside a disused corn crib at the edge of town. The change in the wind went largely unnoticed. The structure had been loaned to Lila Quinn by a farmer who saw more value in his children learning to read than in storing a meager harvest. Light filtered through the gaps in the plank walls, striping the dusty floor and illuminating the intent faces of half a dozen children. They sat on upturned crates and worn feed sacks, their small hands clutching pieces of slate, their brows furrowed in concentration. The air was thick with the scent of old wood, dried corn husks, and the chalky smell of the slate boards. Lila moved between them, her presence a calm and steadying force. She pointed to a crudely drawn A on a young boy's slate, her voice soft but clear. "That's it, Danny. Like the peak of a mountain, strong and tall." She smiled as he beamed with pride, quickly wiping his slate clean with the heel of his hand to try again. These children were the forgotten ones of Esperanza Gulch, the sons and daughters of hard-pressed ranchers and miners. Too poor or too remote to afford a proper schoolhouse, to Lila, they were a field of untilled earth, full of potential. Her camera captured the harsh reality of the West, but here, in this dusty crib, she was trying to cultivate its future. Outside, Elias Rourke was riding the fence line that bordered the town's common grazing land. He had spent the day replacing wire and tamping down loose posts, work that was both mind-numbing and essential. His thoughts were a familiar, circular track of water levels, feed costs, and the ever-present shadow of the Silver Meridian Railroad. He was heading back toward Dry Willow, his mind already on the evening chores, when the wind shifted and brought the smell of smoke to him. It wasn't the heavy, greasy smoke of a chimney, nor the sweet smoke of a campfire. It was the sharp, dangerous scent of dry grass burning. His head came up instantly, his senses on high alert. It was a smell that every man of the plains knew and feared, a smell that was woven into the fabric of his worst memories. His eyes scanned the horizon, searching for the telltale plume of a fire. He saw nothing but the vast, empty sky. But the smell was stronger now, closer. It seemed to be coming from the direction of the town itself. He nudged dust with his heels, urging the horse into a steady trot. As he drew nearer, he saw it, a small curl of gray smoke, almost invisible against the dusky sky, rising from the roof of the old Miller corn crib. It wasn't a blaze. Not yet. It was an ember, a spark, a deadly seed planted on the tinder dry shingles of the roof. Through the gaps in the walls, he could hear the murmur of children's voices. A cold knot tightened in his stomach. He didn't shout. He didn't waste time on warnings. He swung down from his horse, his long legs eating up the ground between him and the crib. The smell was stronger here, a choking, resinous odor. He saw the source. A patch of sun-cured grass just beside the crib had been ignited, probably by a stray spark from a passing train. The small fire had already died out, but not before it had flung a handful of embers onto the roof. He threw open the wide door of the crib. The scene inside was one of peaceful industry, a world away from the danger gathering above them. Lila looked up, her expression shifting from surprise to alarm as she saw his face. "Fire," he said, the single word cutting through the quiet. "On the roof." For a heartbeat, fear flickered in the children's eyes. But Lila's voice, sharp and commanding, gave them no time to panic. "Danny! Sarah! The water barrel now!" she shouted, pointing toward the large rain barrel at the corner of the crib. "The rest of you, grab those empty feed sacks, move!" Her orders galvanized them into action. The children, accustomed to the harsh pragmatism of frontier life, scrambled to obey. Elias was already in motion. He saw a rickety wooden ladder leaning against the side of the crib. It looked unsteady, but it would have to do. He grabbed a heavy wooden bucket, plunged it into the rain barrel Danny and Sarah were struggling to move, and hauled it out, sloshing water over the rim. The sacks. "Get them wet," Lila instructed, herding the smaller children toward the barrel. They dunked the burlap sacks, their small hands working with frantic purpose. Elias hefted the heavy bucket and charged the ladder. The wood groaned under his weight, but it held. He climbed with a swift, desperate economy of motion, his boots finding purchase on the worn rungs. He swung himself onto the low-pitched roof, his boots sliding slightly on the dry shingles. The smoldering patch was small, no bigger than a dinner plate, but it glowed an angry orange, fanned by the relentless wind. He dumped the contents of the bucket over it. The fire hissed in protest, sending up a billow of thick, acrid smoke. It wasn't out. "Another!" he yelled down, his voice raspy from the smoke. Lila was already there, holding up a dripping, heavy sack. "The bucket's too slow," she called. She had organized the children into a line, a small, determined brigade passing the wet sacks from the barrel to the base of the ladder. Elias scrambled back down, grabbed 2 of the sacks, and climbed back onto the roof. He beat at the glowing embers with a heavy, wet burlap, the slapping sound a desperate rhythm against the howling of the wind. Smoke billowed around him, stinging his eyes and catching in his throat. The wind was a malevolent force now, whipping the smoke down and through the wide-open door of the crib, filling the small space with a choking haze. The children began to cough, their eyes streaming. "The door!" someone yelled from inside, their voice tight with panic. "Shut the door. Keep the smoke out." Elias threw the last of his energy into beating out the final, stubborn spark. He heard a scraping sound below and glanced down. Lila was struggling with the massive wooden door, trying to slide it shut against the wind. It was too heavy for her. Without thinking, Elias slid off the roof, landing in a crouch on the dusty ground. He lunged for the door, adding his weight and strength to hers. Together, they forced it shut. In the sudden dimness, he saw the locking bar, a heavy beam of oak designed to keep out thieves and predators. The smoke was still thick, swirling in the close air. On pure instinct, driven by the panicked cries of the children and the urgent need to create a pocket of clean air, he lifted the heavy bar and slammed it home into its iron bracket. The sound echoed in the sudden, claustrophobic silence. For a moment, no one moved. The only sounds were the coughing of the children and the muffled shriek of the wind as it hammered against the plank walls, finding every crack and seam, rattling the very bones of the old building. The world outside had ceased to exist. They were trapped in a smoky, twilight world, their fate in the hands of the man the town called a curse. Lila leaned against the wall, catching her breath. She looked at Elias, her face smudged with soot, her eyes luminous in the gloom. The fear was gone, replaced by something else, something knowing and steady. A small, tired smile touched her lips. "You'll remember this," she said, her voice quiet but carrying clearly in the charged silence. It wasn't a question or a prediction. It was a statement of fact. Outside, the first of the townsfolk had arrived, drawn by the sight of smoke. They saw Elias Rourke's horse standing untethered. They saw the last wisps of smoke curling from the roof of the corn crib where the new schoolteacher held her classes. And then, to their astonishment, they saw the heavy door slide shut and heard the unmistakable, final sound of the bar dropping into place. A woman gasped. "He's locked himself in there with her." The whisper spread through the small crowd like a contagion. "Rourke's got the teacher locked in the crib." The words twisted and darkened as they passed from mouth to mouth. The reality of the fire was forgotten, replaced by a much more salacious and sinister story. They didn't see a rescue. They saw an abduction. They didn't see a man protecting children from smoke. They saw a dangerous loner trapping a vulnerable woman. The curse of Elias Rourke had found a new and terrible chapter. Inside, the smoke began to clear, slowly finding its way out through the same gaps in the walls that had let the embers in. The children, huddled together around Lila, grew quiet. The immediate danger had passed. Elias stood by the door, his hand still resting on the wooden bar. He felt a profound weariness settle into his bones. He had acted without thought, driven by a primal need to protect. Now, in the aftermath, the weight of his actions and how they would be perceived began to dawn on him. He lifted the heavy bar and pushed the door open. Fresh air and the soft light of dusk flooded the crib. He stepped back, blinking, allowing the occupants to emerge. Lila came out last. shepherding the children before her. She was exhausted, a streak of soot running from her temple to her jaw, but the small, knowing smile was still on her face. She stopped in front of him, ignoring the stunned and suspicious stares of the assembled townsfolk. "You'll remember today," she said, her voice soft, meant only for him, "as the day you saved the school." Elias could only nod, dropping his gaze to the dusty ground. Her words were a balm on a wound he hadn't known was so raw. He was a man who measured his life in a litany of failures and losses, a wife he couldn't save from fever, a herd he couldn't save from fire. He remembered only what he had been unable to protect. Lila had just given him a different memory, a memory of success, of salvation. It was a gift so unexpected, so foreign, that he didn't know how to accept it. It settled into the vast, empty space inside him where only loss had resided for so long. He turned away from her, from the accusing eyes of the town, and walked toward his horse. He did not see the well-dressed man standing in the shadows of the saloon's porch. The man was an agent for the Silver Meridian Railroad, a man paid to observe and report, to find weaknesses and exploit them. He had seen the whole affair. He watched Elias Rourke ride away, then made a neat, precise entry in a small, leather-bound notebook. His eyes, cold and devoid of emotion, saw not a hero or a villain, but a lever, a lonely, embattled rancher, now entangled in a fresh scandal, a man who was, perhaps, finally ready to break. The office of Arlen Pike, president of the Esperanza Gulch Bank, was a room designed to suffocate hope, unlike the rest of the town, which was built of rough-hewn timber and sun-bleached adobe. The bank was made of imported brick and had a large glass window that was washed weekly. Inside, the air was still and smelled of ledger ink, old paper, and the faint, cloying scent of Pike's Bay rum tonic. The silence was heavy, broken only by the loud, methodical tick of a large clock on the wall, each second a hammer blow measuring a man's proximity to ruin. Elias sat in a hard-backed chair that felt intentionally uncomfortable. He held his hat in his hands, turning the brim over and over, the gesture a small, physical outlet for the tension coiling in his gut. Arlen Pike sat behind a vast, polished oak desk, a fortress of commerce. He was a man whose softness was a weapon. His hands were plump and white, his face clean-shaven, his smile a thin, bloodless line that never reached his pale gray eyes. He slid a single sheet of paper across the polished surface. It wasn't an aggressive shove, but a smooth, frictionless glide, as if the paper were eager to deliver its own bad news. "Just a formality. Elias," Pike said, his voice as smooth as the wood. "A notice. The board feels, given the uncertainty surrounding your operations, that we must be prudent." Elias picked up the letter. The paper was crisp, the type precise. It was a notice of debt, calling in the loan he had taken out after the fire. The words were wrapped in legal jargon, but the meaning was as sharp and clear as a shard of glass. He had 30 days to pay in full. If he failed, the collateral would be seized. The collateral wasn't the land itself, or the cattle he was slowly trying to rebuild. It was the water rights, the sole ownership of the Dry Willow Well. 30 days. "Arlen," Elias's voice was a low rumble. "The herd's not even fat enough for market yet." Pike steepled his white fingers. "It's a difficult time for everyone. The Silver Meridian Railroad, however, has expressed a great deal of interest in the stability and prosperity of our valley. They believe reliable infrastructure is key. They have partnered with the bank to ensure that vital resources are managed effectively." The threat was unspoken, but perfectly clear. The railroad was the bank, and the bank was Pike. They were squeezing him out, using the law as their lever. The rumors about him, the story of the locked corn crib, it had all served to isolate him, to make him seem unstable, a poor risk. No one would offer him help or credit now. He was alone, and Pike knew it. "The well is all I have," Elias said, the words tasting like ash. "Water is a resource that belongs to the future." "Elias," Pike replied, his smile tightening, "the bank and its partners are simply ensuring that future is secure." As Elias left the bank, the heavy door clicking shut behind him. The dust and the heat of the street felt like a release. He had left a tomb and returned to the world of the living, even if it was a world that was trying to kill him. Miles away, at the Dry Willow Ranch, Lila Quinn was working. She had come out not to pry or to offer condolences for the fire incident, but because she had seen the well from a distance and was drawn to it. It wasn't just a hole in the ground. It was a testament to survival, a centerpiece of the ranch's story. She set up her mahogany and brass camera, carefully adjusting the tripod legs in the uneven dirt. She disappeared under the black focusing cloth. The world outside reduced to an upside-down, shimmering image on the ground glass plate. She framed the shot with a patient, artistic eye. The weathered gray wood of the well house, the thick, frayed rope coiled like a sleeping snake, the worn iron pulley groaning softly in the breeze. And there, on the side of the wooden frame, were the initials, faded by sun and time but still legible, R+M, Rourke and Mary. A simple declaration painted in a happier time. It was a ghost, a whisper of a memory left out in the sun. It was more real, more honest than any of the whispers she had heard in town. This was the story she wanted to tell. She slid a prepared glass plate into the camera, uncapped the lens, and counted the seconds in her head, capturing the quiet light, the silent history. The process was deliberate, almost ceremonial. When she was done, she carefully packed the undeveloped plate into its light-proof wooden box, alongside her bottles of chemicals. The sharp, metallic scent of silver nitrate clung to her fingers, a familiar perfume of her trade. She felt a sense of reverence for the image she had captured, a secret entrusted to her. When Elias returned, he found her packing her equipment. He said nothing of his visit to the bank. The grim set of his jaw was all the explanation she needed. He walked past her, his eyes fixed on the well. It was no longer a monument to his past. It was the sole determinant of his future. He grabbed the handle of the windlass and began to lower the bucket. He knew the feel of it, the precise number of turns it took for the bucket to hit the water. Today, the rope kept unspooling. He cranked a few more turns than usual. His brow furrowed. Finally, he felt the telltale splash, faint and distant. The water was lower, much lower. This was impossible. The few cattle he had left couldn't have drunk that much, and there had been no rain, but no unusual heat either. He hauled the bucket up, his movements quick and tense. As it crested the edge of the well, he peered inside. The water was murky, full of silt from the low level, but there was something else. A faint, rainbow-colored film swirled on the surface, catching the light. He dipped his fingers in, rubbing them together. It was slick, greasy, a thin, unmistakable trace of oil. The pieces clicked into place with sickening clarity. The railroad's sudden partnership with the bank, Pike's impossible deadline, and now, his well, his lifeblood, being mysteriously drained and contaminated. This wasn't drought, it wasn't a curse, it was a quiet, deliberate act of war. The next day, Lila was in town, working in her makeshift darkroom in a rented shed behind the general store. While waiting for a plate to fix, she walked over to the saloon for a cool glass of water. The place was mostly empty in the mid-afternoon, save for a trio of ranch hands nursing beers at a corner table. They were men she recognized, men who had lost their jobs when a neighboring ranch had sold out to a land agent from the Silver Meridian. They were idle, disgruntled, and desperate. They spoke in low voices, but her sharp ears caught snippets of their conversation. "Easy money, up at Midnight Spire," one of them muttered. "The railroad fella said just keep digging." Another one complained about the work, about the smell and the black muck that got on everything. As they stood to leave, Lila noticed their boots. They were caked in mud, but it was a strange, dark, greasy mud, and the edges of their trouser cuffs were stained with the same oily substance she had seen on Elias's fingers the day before. Her mind, trained to see connections and details others missed, began to work. Midnight Spire was a maze of rocky canyons and dry creek beds a few miles north of Dry Willow. It was considered useless land, unless, of course, you weren't interested in what was on the surface. Later that afternoon, she found young Danny, the boy from her class, drawing in the dirt with a stick outside the blacksmith's shop. His family's small claim was on the edge of the Badlands, not far from the canyons. "Danny," she said, her voice gentle, "I have a special assignment for you. You know those canyons better than anyone. I need a map of all the secret places. Can you draw for me all the trails and caves, and any new holes you might have seen, places where men might be working?" The boy's face lit up. To be given such an important task by his teacher was a great honor. He took the piece of slate and the chalk nub she offered him and set to work. His lines were shaky. His sense of scale was imaginative. But the details were there. He drew the main canyon, the twin rock formations that gave the place its name, and then, off to one side, he drew a series of small, hesitant X's. "Men are here," he whispered, pointing a grubby finger. "They make loud noises." That evening, as dusk settled over Dry Willow, Lila found Elias by the corral. She didn't rush. She laid her evidence out piece by piece, as carefully as she would arrange a photograph. She told him about the men in the saloon, their talk of easy money from the railroad. She described the oily stains on their boots, and then she held out the slate. "Danny drew this," she said simply. Elias took the slate. He stared at the child's crude drawing, at the X's that marked the source of his ruin. A cold, hard anger settled in his chest. They were drilling, upstream of his well's aquifer, deliberately diverting the water table and poisoning what was left. He looked at Lila, her face earnest and determined in the fading light. He saw the risk she was taking, the danger she was stepping into for his sake. His first instinct was to shield her from it. "You get involved with them," he said, his voice rough with a mix of gratitude and fear. "You'll see nothing but trouble. This is my fight." Lila did not look away. Her gaze was as steady and clear as the lens of her camera. "Trouble," she said, her voice low but firm, "is staying quiet while they try to rewrite this town's memory. They whisper that you're a curse. Soon, they'll say you ran your own ranch into the ground. They're stealing your water, but they're also stealing your story. That's not just your fight, it's everyone's." Her words struck a chord deep inside him, resonating with a truth he hadn't been able to articulate. She wasn't just offering help. She was offering an alliance built on a shared understanding of justice. He was no longer just a man fighting for his land. He was a man fighting for his name. He looked from her face to the map on the slate, then toward the dark silhouette of the mountains where Midnight Spire lay. The decision was no longer a choice. It was a necessity. "Tomorrow night," he said, handing the slate back to her. "When the moon is late, we'll go see for ourselves." The moon was a sliver of bone in the vast, ink-black sky, offering just enough light to turn the landscape into a treacherous world of sharp edges and deceptive shadows. Here, in the canyons of Midnight Spire, the wind had a different voice. It didn't sigh across open plains. It howled and moaned, funneling through narrow gaps in the rock, carrying the chill of the high desert night. The twin spires of rock that gave the area its name loomed over them, skeletal fingers pointing at the cold, distant stars. Their shadows fell across the canyon floor, long and black, like rivers of solid darkness. They moved in near total silence, a pair of ghosts in a dead land. Elias led his horse, Dust, the animal's shod hooves making only the softest of thuds in the sandy soil. He had chosen their path carefully, staying to the soft ground to muffle their approach. Every line of his body was taut with tension, his head constantly turning, his eyes scanning the ridgeines, his ears straining to separate the sound of the wind from anything man-made. The Colt Peacemaker tucked into his belt was a heavy, comforting weight against his hip. It was not an accessory. It was a tool, and he was prepared to use it. Lila followed a few paces behind, her steps light but deliberate. She had insisted on carrying her own equipment. The heavy box camera was slung over one shoulder, its leather strap digging into her collarbone. In her hand, she carried a tin lantern, but the glass was carefully wrapped in a thick wool cloth, allowing only the faintest, most diffused glow to escape from the top and bottom, just enough to illuminate the ground at her feet. It was a beacon visible only to someone standing right next to her. She also carried a satchel containing her prepared glass plates and a heavy canteen of water from the dry willow well. Every piece of gear felt like an anchor, yet she moved with a focused determination, her senses alive to the alien beauty and palpable danger of the place. The broken, staccato rhythm of their footsteps was the only percussion against the wind's lonely melody. One step, then another, a pause to listen, then forward again. They followed the crude map Danny had drawn, navigating by the shape of the rock formations against the sky. Finally, Elias held up a hand, stopping them in the shadow of a large boulder. The air here was different. The clean, dry scent of dust and sage was tainted by something else, the same greasy, industrial smell from the well, but 100 times stronger. It was the smell of raw petroleum, a violation of the natural order of the desert. Peering around the edge of the boulder, they saw it. In a small, sheltered basin, barely visible in the faint moonlight, was the source of the poison. It wasn't a large operation, a crude, man-powered drilling rig, little more than an A-frame of heavy timbers with a block and tackle, stood over a dark, circular stain on the ground. From the base of the rig, a narrow iron pipe snaked its way across the rock floor, disappearing into a deep fissure in the canyon wall. The ground around the drill site was a slick, black mire of mud and crude oil, shimmering faintly like a beetle's shell. It was a festering wound in the heart of the earth. Elias felt a cold, clean rage settle over him. This was the weapon they were using to kill his ranch, to bleed him dry. It was cowardly, insidious, and brutally effective. He motioned for Lila to stay put. His intention clear: get closer, see everything. But Lila put a hand on his arm, her grip surprisingly strong. She shook her head and pointed toward the pipe, then to the canteen at her hip. She had a plan that went beyond mere observation. They moved with infinite slowness now, circling the basin, using the deep shadows as cover. They reached the point where the iron pipe began its journey toward the fissure. Lila knelt. As she had hoped, there was a crude valve wheel near the joint where the pipe connected to the drilling apparatus, likely used to control the flow. Her fingers, nimble and sure, found the wheel. It was stiff with grime and disuse, but she put her weight into it, turning it slowly, carefully, to avoid making any sound. A quarter turn, a half turn. Finally, it was closed. Then, she unstoppered the canteen. The water she had carried all this way wasn't for drinking. She poured it carefully over the joint and the surrounding ground, washing away the most obvious slicks of oil, diluting the immediate fire hazard. It was a small, almost insignificant act, but it was born of a photographer's understanding of chemistry and a woman's careful foresight. Fire was too unpredictable, too final. Evidence was what they needed. As she worked, a sound cut through the whine of the wind, a single pebble, dislodged from the canyon wall above, skittering down the rock face. It was a small sound, almost lost in the night, but to their heightened senses, it was as loud as a gunshot. Both of them froze, their heads snapping up toward the source of the noise. For a moment, there was nothing but the wind and the pounding of their own hearts. Then, 3 shapes detached themselves from the deep shadows of the cliff. They weren't ghosts. They were men, moving down a narrow, hidden path with a practiced ease. The pale moonlight caught a brief, sharp glint of steel from the hand of the lead man. There was no time for words, no time for plans. They had been seen. The 3 men spread out, moving to flank them. They were big, rough-looking men, the same hired hands Lila had seen in the saloon. Their faces were grim masks in the darkness. Elias reacted with pure, violent instinct. He didn't reach for his pistol to shoot. They were too close for that, and a gunshot would bring the whole nest of hornets down on them. As the first man lunged, a knife held low in a vicious arc. Elias sidestepped and brought the heavy barrel of the Colt Peacemaker down in a brutal, efficient blow against the side of the man's head. There was a sickening, solid thud, and the man crumpled to the ground without a sound. The other two hesitated for a fraction of a second, surprised by the suddenness of the attack. That was all the time Lila needed. She wasn't a fighter, but she was resourceful. She scooped up a double handful of the sandy, gritty soil at her feet and flung it directly into the face of the second man as he advanced on her. He roared in pain and surprise, clawing at his eyes, temporarily blinded. In that same motion, Lila grabbed the iron pipe she'd just been working on and pulled with all her might. It was heavy, but the ground was slick and the joint was already loose. It shifted with a loud, grating screech, breaking its connection. The third man, seeing his companions fall, wisely abandoned the fight. He put a whistle to his lips and blew a single, piercing blast. The sound echoed off the canyon walls, a clear, sharp signal. It was answered almost immediately by the frantic whinny of horses and the thunder of approaching hooves from further down the canyon. They were not alone. The game had changed. This was no longer a fight. It was a flight. Run! Elias's voice was a harsh growl. He grabbed Lila's wrist, his grip like an iron band, and pulled her after him. There was no time to get to his horse. Their only chance was the rough terrain. He half dragged, half threw her toward the dark, jagged line of a dry creek bed at the edge of the basin. They scrambled down the steep, gravelly bank, stones rolling and sliding under their boots. The air was torn from their lungs as they ran, stumbling and sliding through the treacherous, uneven bottom of the wash. The sharp, sword-like leaves of yucca plants tore at their clothes and skin. 1,000 tiny knives in the darkness. Behind them, they could hear the shouts of men and the clatter of hooves on rock. They were being hunted. They were 20 yards down the wash, running for the shelter of a deep bend, when Lila dug her heels in, pulling against Elias's grip. "Wait!" she gasped, her voice ragged. "Lila, no," he snarled, trying to pull her along. "There's no time." But she wrenched her arm free. In the chaos of the chase, with the sounds of their pursuers growing closer, her mind had locked onto a single, clear purpose. She had turned back to face the scene of the fight, her hands, moving with a speed born of countless repetitions, were already working on the camera. She ripped the lens cap off, braced the heavy box against her body, and fumbled in her satchel. It was an act of profound, almost insane, courage. She was a target, illuminated by the pale moonlight, yet her focus was absolute. She brought out a small, T-shaped holder with a packet of magnesium flash powder. With a flick of her thumb, she ignited the fuse. For one brilliant, blinding instant, the entire canyon was lit up as if by a bolt of lightning. The flash was searingly white, erasing the shadows and etching the scene onto the glass plate inside her camera and onto their retinas. In that single, frozen moment, everything was revealed: the crude drilling rig, the dark stain of oil on the ground, the sprawled form of the man Elias had struck down, and the second man, still rubbing at his eyes. And on the jacket of this second man, clear as day in the brutal, instantaneous light, was a stenciled insignia, a circle with the letters S and M intertwined. Silver Meridian. Then, just as quickly, the light was gone, plunging them back into an even deeper darkness, their eyes temporarily blinded by the flash. The roar of the magnesium flare was followed by an enraged shout from their pursuers. The flash had not only been a photograph, it had been a beacon, pinpointing their exact location. "Now run!" Lila screamed, her professional calm shattered, replaced by pure, adrenaline-fueled terror. She shoved the camera back into Elias's hands and scrambled after him into the darkness of the creek bed, the sound of galloping horses nearly upon them. The Sunday air in Esperanza Gulch, for once, was not filled with dust but with the scent of cinnamon and baking pumpkin, the sweet notes of a harmonica, and the murmur of neighborly conversation. The church, a simple wooden structure that served as a courthouse and meeting hall during the week, had organized a small fair on its grounds. The goal was modest: to raise enough money to purchase a proper water wagon and several large, clean barrels. ensuring the children in Lila's makeshift school would have fresh drinking water. It was an island of hope in a sea of hardship. Strings of colored ribbons, faded by the sun, were strung between the sparse trees. A long trestle table groaned under the weight of pies, jars of preserves, and loaves of fresh-baked bread. People who normally kept to their own isolated ranches had come into town, their faces washed clean, wearing their best, if worn, Sunday clothes. It was a fragile truce with the harshness of their daily lives. Lila stood by a large wooden board she had propped against the church wall. Pinned to it were a dozen of her photographs, a gallery of the town's soul. She had not chosen dramatic landscapes or portraits of important men. Instead, she had captured the small, unheralded moments of their lives. There was a picture of the blacksmith, his massive hands, caked in soot, gently holding a tiny, intricate metal flower he had forged for his daughter. There was a shot of young Danny and his friends, their face split by wide, toothy grins as they chased a runaway chicken. There was an image of the preacher's wife, her face in profile against a window, her expression one of quiet, weary endurance. These were pictures of them, their true selves, stripped of rumor and reputation. The townspeople gathered around the display, speaking in low, appreciative tones. They saw themselves not as failures or victims of a harsh land, but as people who worked and loved and endured. It was a powerful, unspoken argument for their own collective worth. Lila watched them, her heart full. She knew the other photograph, the one that lay undeveloped in its dark box, was a weapon. But these pictures, these were a shield. Into this scene of fragile community walked Arlen Pike. He moved through the small crowd like a shark through a school of fish, his polished boots silent on the dusty ground. He was not a man who belonged at a church fair, but he wore a mask of benevolent concern, nodding and smiling, his pale eyes taking in everything. He was flanked by the well-dressed, cold-eyed agent from the Silver Meridian, a man who seemed to cast a chill over everything he looked at. Pike stopped near the water donation bucket, a large wooden pail where people had been dropping their hard-earned pennies and nickels. He made a show of pulling a silver dollar from his waistcoat and dropping it in. The coin landed with a loud, ostentatious clatter that silenced the nearby conversations. "A wonderful cause," Pike announced, his voice smooth and carrying. "Truly, the welfare of our children is the foundation of our future." He smiled, a thin, practiced expression. "And in that spirit of progress, I have been thinking, this constant worry over water, it divides us. It distracts us from the important work of building a prosperous community." He paused, letting his words sink in. Elias stood at the edge of the crowd, his arms crossed over his chest, his face an unreadable mask. He watched Pike with a flat, unwavering gaze. "Therefore," Pike continued, raising his voice slightly, "as a gesture of civic partnership, my bank, with the support of our forward-thinking friends at the Silver Meridian Railroad, is prepared to take on the burden of the Dry Willow Well. We will manage it as a public trust, ensuring fair and equitable distribution for all, allowing Mr. Rourke to focus on his other pressing matters. Let us all move forward, together, by entrusting this vital resource to professional, stable hands." A ripple of uncertainty went through the crowd. On the surface, it sounded reasonable, generous even. But they knew Pike, they knew the railroad. They looked from Pike's smooth, placid face to Elias's hard, weathered one. They were being asked to choose, and the weight of old rumors pressed down on them. Before anyone could voice an opinion, the disruption began. The three ranch hands Lila had seen in the saloon, the same men who had ambushed them at Midnight Spire, began to move through the crowd. They weren't overtly aggressive, just clumsy and careless. One of them, a big man with a slack jaw, stumbled near the trestle table, jostling it hard enough to send a pumpkin pie sliding to the ground. Another laughed too loudly at a crude joke, his voice grating on the quiet Sunday atmosphere. Their target, however, was the donation bucket. The big man lurched toward it as if he had tripped, his arms swinging out. The heavy pail of water and coins went flying. crashing to the ground. Water soaked into the thirsty dust, and the precious collection of coins scattered, disappearing into the dirt. Several of the younger children, who had been proudly guarding the bucket, burst into tears at the sight of their hard work being destroyed. It was a small act of violence, but it was perfectly calculated. It shattered the day's peaceful mood, replacing it with confusion and distress. The railroad agent watched from the sidelines, a flicker of satisfaction in his cold eyes. Pike looked on with an expression of feigned dismay. The crowd murmured, turning toward Elias as if by instinct. This was his world, the world of trouble and conflict. They expected him to react as he always had, with anger, perhaps with his fists or the gun on his hip. They saw his shoulders tense, his hands clench into tight fists at his sides. But he didn't move toward the thugs. Instead, he took a slow, deliberate step forward. His eyes locked on Arlen Pike. He reached into the inner pocket of his duster and pulled out a single, folded sheet of paper. It was the loan notice. He didn't shout. He didn't make accusations. He simply unfolded the paper and began to read, his voice low and steady, but carrying with a grim clarity in the sudden silence. "Loan principal," he read. $200. Agreed. He paused. Drought risk adjustment fee, $50. A few people exchanged confused glances. Fire liability premium, retroactive $75. The murmuring began to grow. These were not normal banking terms. Community instability surcharge, Elias continued, his voice flat and devoid of emotion. $40. Special assessment for resource management consultation, $60. He looked up from the paper, his gaze sweeping over the faces of his neighbors. "I'm a rancher," he said simply. "I know cattle and I know the land, but I don't know these words. I just know that my $200 loan to buy feed has become a $425 debt in 6 months. The focus of the crowd shifted completely. They were no longer looking at Elias as the source of the town's bad luck. They were looking at Arlen Pike, the man who had just spoken of partnership and progress, and seeing a predator. They were ranchers and miners and storekeepers. They all had loans. They all lived under the shadow of the bank. Elias's struggle was suddenly their own. The whispers changed, the tone shifting from suspicion to anger. The name on their lips was no longer Rourke. It was Pike. Lila had moved silently to Elias's side. She leaned in, her voice a bare whisper against the rising anger of the crowd. "Tonight," she said, her breath warm against his ear, "we develop the photograph. Truth needs light." He gave a short, almost imperceptible nod. He felt her strength, her conviction, flowing into him. He was no longer a man standing alone against the world. Pike's mask of civility had cracked. A blotchy, red flush was creeping up his neck. He shot a venomous glare at Elias and Lila, a look of pure, unadulterated hatred. He had lost control of the narrative, and he knew it. Seeing his employer's fury, one of the thugs decided to offer a more personal form of intimidation. He sauntered over, a belligerent swagger in his walk, and stopped in front of Lila. He looked her up and down with a contemptuous sneer. Then, he turned his head and spat a thick wad of tobacco juice into the dust. Less than an inch from the toe of her boot, the insult was profound, a deliberate defilement of her presence. The crowd gasped. Elias went absolutely still. A dangerous, white-hot fire ignited in his eyes. Every instinct, every fiber of his being, screamed at him to lash out, to smash the man's leering face into the dirt. His hand twitched, moving instinctively toward the gun at his hip. But then he felt a faint pressure on his arm. It was Lila's hand, her touch light but firm. It was a silent plea, a reminder of their purpose. This was not a brawl to be won with fists. It was a war to be won with truth. He took a slow, ragged breath, forcing the rage down. He unclenched his jaw, the muscle in his cheek jumping. He held the man's gaze, his eyes promising a reckoning that would not be settled here, in the dust of a churchyard. He had won the bigger battle. He would not lose the war over a petty skirmish. At that moment, as the tension stretched to the breaking point, the church bell began to ring. Its clear, resonant tones pealed out over the silent crowd, signaling the end of the afternoon service. But today, it sounded like something more. It was a call to order, an announcement. The pastor appeared on the church steps. "There will be a town meeting," he declared, his voice ringing with newfound authority. "Tonight, after sundown, all matters will be heard." The bell continued to toll, a solemn, steady rhythm, a promise of judgment, a promise that the truth, however long it had been buried, would finally be brought into the light. The back storeroom of the general store was a small, windowless box that smelled of burlap, dried beans, and ancient dust. But tonight, Lila had transformed it into a sanctuary, a place of alchemy where light and shadow were made to tell the truth. The only illumination came from a single lantern, its glass panes covered in a deep red cloth. It cast a strange, bloody glow over the room, turning familiar objects into alien shapes. A rough wooden bench was crowded with glass bottles, trays, and measuring cups. In this crimson twilight, the world was stripped of its color, reduced to shades of black and deep, unsettling red. The air was thick with a sharp, clean scent of chemicals. It was a smell that clung to Lila's clothes and hair, the signature of her trade. It was the smell of collodion, a sweet, ether-like odor, the acrid bite of acetic acid, and the faint, metallic tang of the silver nitrate bath. To Elias, who stood awkwardly near the door, his large frame seeming to shrink the room by half, it was as foreign as the surface of the moon. The only sound, besides their own quiet breathing, was the slow, steady drip of water from a leaky spot in the ceiling into a bucket in the corner. Drip, drip, drip. Each drop was a tiny hammer, marking the passage of tense, silent seconds. Lila worked with a quiet, focused grace. Her movements were precise, economical, like a surgeon's. There was no wasted motion, no hesitation. She took the exposed glass plate from its light-proof holder, her fingers handling it by the very edges. The plate looked blank, inert, a simple piece of glass holding an invisible secret. Elias watched her, his rough, calloused hands clasped behind his back, feeling useless and clumsy in this delicate, alien environment. "The developer first," she said, her voice a low murmur, not wanting to break the spell. "It coaxes the image out of hiding." She poured a syrupy, amber-colored liquid from a bottle into a shallow black tray. Then, with a steady hand, she slid the glass plate into the solution, ensuring the liquid flowed over it in a single, smooth wave. She rocked the tray gently, her eyes fixed on the surface of the plate. For a long, agonizing moment, nothing happened. The glass remained blank, a dark mirror reflecting the red light of the lantern. Elias held his breath, a knot of doubt tightening in his stomach. Had it all been for nothing? The risk, the frantic chase through the canyon, had the flash failed? Had her courage been in vain? And then it began. Like a ghost materializing from thin air, a faint, milky whiteness started to bloom in the center of the plate. It was magic. There was no other word for it. Slowly, shapes began to resolve themselves from the chemical fog. The hard, angular lines of the drilling rig emerged first, a skeletal structure against a dark background. Then, the slick, dark curve of the iron pipe snaking across the ground. Lila's breathing was a soft, steady whisper beside him. Elias found himself leaning closer, his own breath caught in his throat. The details sharpened, becoming more defined with every gentle rock of the tray. He could see the sprawled, unconscious form of the man he had struck down. He could see the second man, his face contorted as he clawed at his eyes. And then, on the man's jacket, the final piece of the puzzle swam into focus. The two letters, intertwined inside a circle, stark and undeniable in the chemical bloom. SM, Silver Meridian. It was all there. The entire crime, captured in silver and light on a simple pane of glass. It was irrefutable. Silent testimony, a weapon more powerful than any gun. Elias stared at the image, mesmerized. In the dark, reflective surface of the developing plate, He could see his own reflection, a shadowy figure superimposed over the scene. His face, gaunt and tired, floated over the image of the drilling rig. His broad shoulders seemed to merge with the darkness of the canyon, and his hands, his rough, scarred rancher's hands, looked like they were resting on the very evidence that could save him or destroy him. He saw those hands and, for the first time in a long time, he felt them tremble. It was a slight, almost imperceptible tremor, born of rage and exhaustion and a sudden, overwhelming wave of grief. The image in the tray wasn't just proof of a crime against his land. It was a reflection of all his failures. The fire, the drought, Mary. He had stood by, just as he was standing now, and watched as the things he loved were consumed, helpless to stop the devastation. He had retreated into himself, building a wall of silence and solitude around his heart, telling himself it was strength, but it wasn't. It was fear. "I used her memory," he said, the words tearing themselves from his throat, raw and quiet. They fell into the silent waiting room with the weight of stones. Mary's memory. I let it become an excuse, a reason to keep everyone away, a reason to fail. He didn't look at Lila. He couldn't. He kept his eyes fixed on the image in the tray, on his own ghostly reflection. It was the most honest thing he had said in 5 years. Lila stopped rocking the tray. She did not offer pity or cheap comfort. She simply stood beside him, a steady presence in the crimson gloom. After a long moment, she lifted the plate from the developer with a pair of wooden tongs and slipped it into a tray of clear water to stop the process. "Memory is a home," she said, her voice soft as velvet. "It's the place you go to remember who you are. It's not supposed to be a prison." Her words were simple, yet they cut through the layers of guilt and grief he had wrapped around himself. A home, not a prison. He had been living in a cage of his own making, with Mary's memory serving as the bars. It was in that moment of profound, painful clarity that a new sound broke the silence. It came from outside, the heavy, unmistakable tread of boots on the wooden boardwalk that ran behind the store. Not one person, but 2, maybe 3. The footsteps were slow, deliberate, searching. They stopped directly outside their door. Elias's head snapped up, every muscle in his body instantly rigid. He shot a look at Lila, his eyes wide with alarm. She froze, her hand hovering over the tray. The steady drip of water in the corner suddenly sounded as loud as a drumbeat. A shadow blotted the thin crack of light under the door. Then came the sound that made the blood run cold in their veins, the dry, metallic rattle of the iron door latch being lifted and turned. The door was unlocked. Elias moved with a speed and silence that was terrifying. He didn't speak. He simply raised a finger to his lips, a command for absolute stillness. He took 2 long, silent strides to the door, his own boots making no sound on the packed earth floor. He reached out, his hand moving with infinite slowness toward the heavy wooden bar that rested in a bracket on the wall. Outside, the latch rattled again, more insistently this time. A low, muffled voice muttered something they couldn't understand. Elias's fingers closed around the thick, smooth wood of the bar. He did not look away from Lila's face. His eyes held hers, a silent communication passing between them. He was not the panicked man in the corn crib, blindly seeking refuge. This was different. This was a conscious, deliberate act of protection. He was guarding the truth. He was guarding her. With a motion as smooth and quiet as a sigh, he lifted the heavy bar and slid it into its iron brace on the door. There was no loud thud, no final clang, just the soft, decisive whisper of wood settling into iron. The door was barred. They were safe. He saw the understanding in Lila's eyes. He saw the fear recede, replaced by the same steady, knowing light he had seen in the corn crib. A small, tired, but genuine smile touched her lips. She held his gaze, and in the deep red light of the dark room, she whispered the words that had now become their covenant. "You'll remember this." Outside, after another moment of frustrated silence and a final, angry jiggle of the latch, the footsteps moved on. They heard them recede down the boardwalk, the sound fading until it was once again swallowed by the vast silence of the night. A long, collective breath escaped them both, a sigh of relief that seemed to physically push the tension out of the small room. Elias leaned his forehead against the cool wood of the door, his eyes closed. Lila turned back to her work. She moved the plate to the final tray, the fixer, which would make the image permanent. As the last of the milky residue cleared, the picture became sharp and brilliant. A perfect, damning record of the crime at Midnight Spire. The proof was no longer a ghost. It was real. It was alive. She lifted the finished plate, the water dripping from its edges like tears. "It's done," she said softly. Elias turned from the door. He looked at the plate, then at his own hands, which were smudged with dust and grime. He felt an overwhelming urge to wipe them clean, as if reading his mind. Lila picked up a clean, dry linen cloth from her workbench and held it out to him. He reached for it, and as he took it, his fingers brushed against hers. His skin was warm, calloused, radiating a dry heat from a life lived under the sun. Hers was cool, smooth, and slightly damp from the chemical baths. The contrast was startling, a brief, electric touch that was more intimate than any embrace. It was the meeting of two different worlds, the man of earth and dust, and the woman of light and silver. For a fleeting second, in the quiet safety of their crimson-lit sanctuary, they were simply two people, holding a fragile truth, their hands briefly clasped in a silent promise. The church was full. It was a sight no one had seen since the last big revival meeting. Years ago, every bench was crammed with the people of Esperanza Gulch, their faces tense and expectant in the flickering yellow light of the oil lamps. The air, usually still and smelling of dry hymnals and old wood, was thick with the scent of dust, sweat, and a shared, unspoken anxiety. This was not a congregation gathered for worship. It was a jury, assembled to pass judgment. At the front, standing behind the simple wooden pulpit that served as his bench, was Sheriff Harlan Gibbs. He was a tall, stooped man, whose face was a road map of sun and wind. He held a small wooden mallet instead of a gavel. He struck the pulpit once, the sound a flat, dull thud in the crowded room. "This meeting is called to order," he said, his voice a low, gravelly rasp, a sound permanently hoarced by decades of breathing trail dust. "Mr. Pike is asked to speak on a matter of public interest. Mr. Rourke has also asked to be heard. We will hear them both. We will be civil." His eyes swept the room, a silent warning that carried more weight than his words. Arlen Pike rose from the front bench, smoothing the front of his immaculate waistcoat. He walked to the front of the church, his polished shoes making no sound. He placed his plump, white hands on the edge of the pulpit, leaning forward as if to share a sacred confidence. "My friends, my neighbors," he began, his voice a balm of smooth reason. "I look out at your faces, and I see the same thing I see every day from the window of my bank. I see hard-working, honest people struggling to build a life in a hard land." He paused, letting the flattery settle. "But we are hampered. We are held back by uncertainty. The recent incidents have highlighted a grave danger in our midst, the instability of our water supply." He let his gaze drift towards Elias, who sat alone on a bench near the back. A silent, stony island in a sea of murmuring people. "For the safety and security of this entire community," Pike continued, his voice resonating with false sincerity. "For the future of our children, a resource as vital as the dry willow well cannot be left in the hands of one individual beset by misfortune. Therefore, I formally propose that the bank, as a neutral and stable custodian, assume management of the well for the public good. It is the only way to ensure our shared prosperity." He finished with a small, benevolent smile, as if he had just offered them salvation. A low murmur of agreement rippled through a portion of the crowd. It was a logical, tempting offer. It promised stability. It played on their deepest fears and their lingering suspicions of the man they had long considered a curse. Before the murmur could grow into consensus, Lila Quinn stood up. She did not move to the front. She simply stood by her bench, holding a large, flat object wrapped in cloth. All eyes turned to her. "Sheriff," she said, her voice clear and steady, cutting through the thick air. "Before the town decides its future, they should see the present." She walked to the large wooden display board that had earlier held her photographs of the townspeople. She unwrapped the object. It was the glass plate from the night before, now mounted in a simple wooden frame. She hung it on a nail in the center of the board. It was too far away for most to see the details clearly. She retrieved an oil lamp from the wall, its glass chimney clean, its wick trimmed high. She held it up, moving the light across the surface of the photograph. The image, stark and clear in the focused light, was projected onto the whitewashed wall behind the pulpit. A giant, ghostly tableau. A collective gasp went through the church. There, larger than life, was the scene from Midnight Spire, the crude drilling rig, the dark, slick stain of oil on the ground. The two figures, one sprawled unconscious, the other frozen in the act of shielding his face, and on that man's jacket, magnified by the lamp's projection, were the two letters, stark and undeniable. SM, Silver Meridian. A man in the back whispered, the name spreading through the room like a contagion. The truth, held in a fragile frame of glass and wood, had been set loose. The room erupted in a chaos of hushed, angry voices. The hired hands who had been at the fair were scattered through the crowd. One of them, a young man with fear in his eyes, jumped to his feet. "We was just hired on," he blurted out, his voice cracking. "We was just told to drill. We didn't know." He stopped abruptly, his words choked off. His eyes were fixed on the back of the room, where the cold-eyed railroad agent sat, unmoving. The agent's gaze was like a physical blow, a silent, venomous threat that slammed the young man back down onto his bench, his face pale, his confession stillborn. The silence that followed was more damning than any accusation. Into that silence, Elias Rourke rose and walked to the front. He did not look at Pike or the photograph. He looked at the faces of his neighbors. "There's been a lot of talk," he began, his voice low and rough, the sound of a man not used to public speaking. "Talk about me, about a locked door." He took a breath. That day, at the corn crib, smoke was pouring in. The children were choking. The wind was hammering the door. I barred it to keep the smoke out, not to keep people in. He paused, and for the first time, he looked directly at the families of the children he had saved. "A child's memory is a fragile thing," he said, his voice softening with an emotion no one had ever heard from him before. "They should remember their school as a safe place, a place of learning, not a place of fear and smoke. That day, I chose to protect that memory. I chose to protect your children." He had taken their most potent rumor, their darkest suspicion, and turned it inside out. He had not defended himself. He had explained his care. He hadn't spoken of his own innocence, but of their children's. The story of Rourke the kidnapper died in that moment, replaced by the image of Rourke the protector. The expressions on the faces before him began to shift, moving from suspicion to something like shame, and then to a dawning respect. Sheriff Harlan leaned forward, his knuckles white on the pulpit. His gaze bypassed Elias and settled on the railroad agent at the back. "Drilling on private land, diverting a man's water, that's a serious crime in this territory," Harlan said, his voice a low growl. "Who authorized it?" The agent, a man named Caldwell, who had always moved with an air of untouchable superiority, seemed to shrink in his seat. He shifted, his confident demeanor evaporating under the collective stare of the entire town. I am merely an observer," he stammered, his voice thin. "A consultant for the railroad's expansion." "An observer with a private army," Harlan countered, his voice like iron. "I want to see your authorization, now." Trapped. Caldwell reluctantly reached into the inner pocket of his coat. He produced a folded letter, his movements stiff. Harlan motioned for it to be passed forward. The letter moved from hand to hand, a toxic object no one wanted to hold, until it reached the front. Harlan unfolded it, holding it up to the lamplight. "A letter of commission," Harlan announced, "granting Mr. Caldwell broad authority to secure all necessary resources for the railroad's advance, signed by the Vice President of the Silver Meridian Railroad." Harlan Pike saw his entire scheme collapsing. He lunged forward, his face slick with sweat. "This is an outrage," he sputtered, pointing a shaking finger at Caldwell. "I had no knowledge of this man's illegal activities. The bank was merely an interested party. Acting in good faith for the town's security, I am as much a victim as anyone." His denial was loud, desperate, and, for a moment, almost believable. But Lila was ready. "Sheriff," she said, her voice cutting through Pike's blustering. She held up a second, smaller photograph. She didn't hang this one. She walked it directly to the pulpit and handed it to Harlan. Harlan held the new photograph up. It was a close-up shot, stark and clear. It showed the rough, planked floor of a storeroom, and on that floor were several overlapping boot prints, made in a dark, greasy, oily mud. "Those prints," Lila stated, her voice ringing with conviction, "were photographed this morning, on the floor of the back storeroom of the Esperanza Gulch Bank." The final piece of the puzzle slammed into place. The circle was complete. The hired hands, paid by the railroad agent, their boots caked in the oily mud from the illegal drill site, had clearly been in Pike's bank. His denial was not just a lie. It was an insult to their intelligence. The room exploded. It was not a murmur this time. It was a roar of collective fury. The years of quiet resentment, of being squeezed and bled by Pike's exorbitant fees and predatory loans, erupted in a wave of righteous anger. Men were on their feet, shouting, shaking their fists. The fragile peace of the church was shattered. Harlan hammered the pulpit with his mallet, the blows barely audible over the din. "Order," he bellowed. "Order." He took the railroad's letter of commission, and with a thick pencil wrote "void" across it in large, angry letters. He then produced an official-looking document from his own pocket. "By the authority vested in me by this territory," he declared, his voice rising above the noise, "I am issuing a temporary injunction. All drilling operations at Midnight Spire are to cease immediately, pending a full investigation by the territorial marshal." He slammed an ink stamp down on the paper, the seal of the law. He confiscated the letter and the injunction. His message clear: the town's law would stand against the railroad's power. The atmosphere in the church had undergone a profound chemical change. The suspicion that had isolated Elias for years had been transferred, in its entirety, to Pike and the railroad. But it was more than a simple transfer of blame. In coming together to confront a common enemy, they had forged a new bond. They were no longer a collection of suspicious, frightened individuals. They were a community. They looked at Elias Rourke, and they no longer saw a man cursed by tragedy. They saw a man who had endured, who had fought back, who had refused to be broken. They saw the man who had protected their children. They saw a reflection of their own resilience. Slowly, one by one, men began to move. They left their benches, not to leave the church, but to cross the central aisle. A rancher who had lost land to the bank came and stood near Elias's bench. The blacksmith, a silent giant of a man, came and stood behind him. The young farmer whose children were in Lila's class, one after another, they quietly moved. Their physical presence a declaration of allegiance. They were no longer standing apart from him. They were standing with him. A new memory had just been written, not in a ledger book or on a glass plate, but in the collective heart of the town. The memory of this night, this trial, this victory. And in the center of that memory stood the lonely rancher, who was, finally, no longer alone. Defeat does not make men like Caldwell reasonable. It makes them desperate, cornered by the law, publicly humiliated, and facing the wrath of his employers. The railroad agent did not retreat. He escalated. He saw Elias Rourke not as a man who had won, but as the sole cause of his own ruin, and in the black, bitter calculus of his mind. If his own future was to be ashes, he would first make sure Rourke's was already burning. He gathered the last of his loyal, paid thugs, the ones too stupid or too vicious to abandon a losing fight. Their instructions were simple. Their tool, the oldest and most terrible in the West, a single-lit match and the cooperation of a restless wind. The west wind began to blow just after midnight, a dry, hot gust that rattled the windows of Dry Willow Ranch and carried the scent of distant rain that would never fall. It was a fire wind. Elias knew it in his bones. He was already awake, standing on his porch and staring into the darkness, a strange disquiet settling in his soul. He had won the battle in the church, but the war, he knew, was not over. He saw it first as a faint, unnatural orange glow on the black horizon. Far to the west, on the edge of his grazing lands, it was too low for the moon, too steady for lightning. His blood went cold. He had seen this glow before. He carried the memory of it on his own skin. Then the wind brought the smell, the sharp, hungry scent of burning mesquite and dry grass. The glow brightened, swelling from a flicker to a broad, menacing smile on the horizon. The fire was moving fast, driven by the relentless wind. There was no time for panic. There was only time for action. "Lila!" His voice was a raw, urgent crack in the night. "Get to the well now." He didn't wait for a reply. He sprinted for the barn, his long legs eating up the ground. The panicked lowing of his small herd of cattle was already a rising chorus of terror. He burst into the barn, grabbing a heavy harness and throwing it over dust, the horse's eyes wide and white in the dim light. He didn't bother with a saddle. He hooked the traces to the heaviest thing he had, an old, iron-toothed harrow, a set of heavy blades designed to break up hard soil. Tonight, it would be a plow, a shield, a weapon against the flames. By the time he rode out of the barn, the fire was no longer a glow. It was a living thing, a roaring, incandescent monster that was devouring his land. The wind drove it forward in great, leaping tongues of flame, 50 feet long, that licked the sky and painted the underside of the smoke clouds a terrifying, bloody orange. The sound of it was a physical presence, a deafening, constant roar like 1,000 freight trains. He rode dust hard, not away from the fire, but alongside it, the heavy harrow bouncing and scraping on the hard earth behind him. He steered the horse in a wide, sweeping arc, positioning himself between the advancing inferno and his homestead. Then, he turned the horse and began to plow. The harrow bit into the dry earth, tearing a wide, dark scar in the pale grass. It was brutal, bone-jarring work. Sparks from the fire, carried on the wind, rained down around him, stinging his face and setting tiny, fleeting fires in the horse's mane. The heat was a physical blow, so intense it felt like it was cooking the air from his lungs. He leaned low over the horse's neck, his face buried in its mane, shouting words of encouragement that were swallowed by the fire's roar. He was creating a firebreak, a desperate, defiant line in the dirt, telling the monster this far, and no further. Back at the ranch house, Lila worked with a frantic, focused energy. The well, once the symbol of their struggle, was now the heart of their defense. She threw her weight onto the long iron handle of the hand pump, her body a piston of rhythmic motion, up and down, the pump handle squeaking in protest. A gush of cool, life-giving water poured from the spout. The first bucket was filled by the blacksmith, his massive frame a silhouette against the fire's glare. He didn't wait for instructions. He grabbed it and ran towards the barn, whose dry, timbered roof was the most vulnerable point. Soon, others arrived. The men Elias had stood with in the church. They had seen the glow from town, and they had come. They grabbed shovels, axes, anything they could find, and began to widen the firebreak Elias had started, beating back the smaller flames that leapt across the line with a desperate fury. Lila became the general of a small, determined army. "Form a line," she shouted, her voice sharp and clear above the din. "From the well to the barn pass the buckets, don't run. Don't waste a drop." The women of the town, who had followed their husbands, formed the bucket brigade. Hands accustomed to kneading dough and mending clothes now gripped the heavy, sloshing wooden pails. They passed them from one to another, a living conduit of water, their faces grim and set, smudged with soot, illuminated by the hellish light. The air was filled with the roar of the fire, the panicked bellows of the cattle, and the sharp, shouted commands of men and women united in a single, desperate purpose. The fire raged against the firebreak, a wild beast throwing itself against the bars of a cage. It was a battle of inches, fought with shovels, wet burlap sacks, and sheer, bloody-minded determination. For every flame they beat down, a dozen more seemed to spring up in its place. Then, the moment they all dreaded, the wind, in a furious gust, lifted a great burning branch of mesquite and hurled it high into the air. It cartwheeled through the smoke-choked sky, a fiery comet, and landed squarely on the dry, shingled roof of the barn. A single, orange spot appeared. In seconds, it blossomed into a hungry patch of flame. "The roof!" someone screamed. Lila saw a ladder propped against the side of the barn. Without a second thought, she hitched up her skirts and began to climb. The rungs were slick with ash and water. The smoke billowed down, hot and choking, making her eyes stream. She climbed higher, a bucket in one hand. Reaching for the flames, she was halfway up when her foot slipped on a wet rung. For a terrifying, weightless moment, she was falling. She cried out, not in fear, but in frustration. She didn't hit the ground. A body, solid as an oak tree, slammed into the base of the ladder, absorbing the impact of her fall and steadying the shuddering frame. Elias was there. He had abandoned his work on the firebreak, his face a black mask of soot, his eyes wild. He pressed his entire body against the ladder, pinning it to the wall, his shoulder taking the brunt of the force. A sharp, grinding pain shot through him, but he barely noticed. Lila clung to the rungs, her breath coming in ragged gasps. She looked down into his upturned face, into his smoke-ringed, desperate eyes. "Don't let me go," she whispered, the words a raw plea. "Never," he answered, his voice a low, guttural promise. His eyes did not leave the fire licking at the roof above her. His focus was absolute. His body would be her anchor. His will would be her shield. Gaining her footing, she scrambled the rest of the way up and flung the contents of the bucket onto the flames. The fire hissed and shrank, but it did not die. From the edge of the property, a new sound cut through the roar. A single, loud gunshot fired into the air. It was followed by another. Sheriff Harlan, having anticipated Caldwell's next move, had gathered a posse and circled around behind the fire. The gunshots were the signal. They were closing the trap. Shouts and curses erupted from the darkness beyond the flames as the arsonists were run down and captured. A few of them were brought down, still holding their torches, their faces a mask of surprise and fear. The battle had turned. With the arsonists captured and the main fire line holding, the townsfolk redoubled their efforts on the barn. A fresh wave of buckets reached Lila. She doused the flames again and again, until the last stubborn ember finally died with a defeated hiss. Slowly, agonizingly, the fire began to lose its strength. The great wall of flame shrank back to a creeping line of orange, then to 1,000 smoldering patches in the blackened field. The roar subsided to a crackle, then to a whisper. The night, which had been as bright as a hellish noon, slowly returned to darkness. The aftermath was a landscape of ghosts. The air was thick with the smell of charcoal, wet ash, and the faint, sickening scent of singed hair. But underneath it all was another smell, clean and cool, the smell of the water from the dry willow well, the water that had saved them. Lila climbed down from the ladder, her legs trembling so violently she could barely stand. She was covered in soot from head to toe. Her dress was torn. Her hands were raw. Elias met her at the bottom, his left arm hanging limply at his side, his shoulder a knot of agony. They stood there for a moment, swaying with exhaustion, surrounded by the quiet, weary figures of their neighbors. Lila looked out at the smoldering, blackened field, at the dark shapes of the men and women who had stood with them. A tremor ran through her, a delayed reaction of fear and adrenaline. But as she looked at Elias, a slow smile spread across her soot-stained face. It was a smile of profound, exhausted triumph. "You'll remember tonight," she said, her voice hoarse from the smoke, but steady. As the night we didn't run. Elias looked at her, at the incredible, unbreakable spirit shining in her eyes. He had spent years running from his past, from his pain, from any connection to the world. Tonight, he had stood his ground. They had stood their ground. He looked down at the camera, which she had managed to save from the house and was now slung over her shoulder, miraculously unharmed. It was her tool, her eye, her memory keeper. He reached out, not to touch her, but to gently place his good hand on the cool, wooden body of the camera. It was a gesture of profound reverence. He was covering the lens, not to block its view, but as if to protect it, to cherish the powerful, unshot memory that they had just forged together in the fire. It was a memory of shared struggle, of a community reborn, a memory that needed no glass plate to be made permanent. It was already etched into the very landscape of their lives. The reckoning came not with a bang, but with the scratch of a pen on paper. The day after the fire. Sheriff Harlan's office was small and stuffy, smelling of stale coffee and sun-baked dust. Arlen Pike sat in a chair, his usual immaculate suit looking rumpled, his face pale and pasty. The railroad agent, Caldwell, stood in a corner, his hands bound in front of him with a pair of grim, iron handcuffs, his cold eyes finally lowered to the floor. Sheriff Harlan sat behind his desk, which was cluttered with wanted posters and territorial statutes. He pushed a fresh ledger and a pen towards Pike. "You're going to write a new loan agreement for Elias Rourke," Harlan said, his voice flat, leaving no room for argument. "And I'm going to watch you do it." Pike began to bluster. "Sheriff, this is highly irregular. Bank policy clearly states—" "Bank policy burned a man's pasture last night," Harlan cut in, his voice like grinding stones. "Bank policy tried to steal his water and ruin his name. Today, we're going with my policy. Now, pick up the pen." Pike, his face sweating, picked up the pen. "Principal $200, Harlan dictated, as if he were reading a death sentence. That's what he borrowed. That's what he owes. He leaned back. Now, all those extra fees, the drought risk adjustment, the community instability surcharge, you're going to write them down, every last one." Pike's hand shook as he wrote. When he was done, Harlan leaned forward again. "Good. Now, next to each of those, you're going to write waived, and then you're going to sign a receipt, acknowledging that those fees were charged in error. This is extortion," Pike hissed, his voice a wet whisper. "No, Harlan," Harlan said, his voice dangerously quiet. "Extortion is what you do. This is an adjustment. A correction in the civic ledger. Defeated." Pike wrote. The scratching of his pen was the only sound. When the fees were waived, Harlan continued. "Now, the payment terms. The original due date is void. The new due date will be 90 days after the first significant autumn rain. Payment will be based on the market price of his calf yield. If the herd thrives, the town thrives. The bank gets its money. If the herd fails because the land is burned and the water is stolen, we all bear the burden." He pointed a thick, uncompromising finger at Pike. "That's what community means. Now write it down." While Pike was rewriting his own defeat, a territorial marshal, summoned by Harlan via telegraph the night before, let a cuffed and sullen Caldwell out of the office. The Silver Meridian Railroad had received an official injunction, delivered by wire, halting all survey and drilling operations in the entire valley pending a full federal investigation. The agent who had acted with such impunity was now just another prisoner. His head bowed as he was led to a wagon that would take him to the territorial capital. The Iron Snake had been stopped, at least for now, by the will of a small, dusty town. The days that followed were filled with the sounds of rebuilding. The fire had taken much, but it had given something back, a sense of common purpose. The community, which had once whispered about Elias in the shadows, now worked alongside him in the bright, unforgiving sun. The blacksmith organized a crew to cut and haul timber from the high country. They worked to replace the fire-damaged sections of the barn, the rhythmic thud of their hammers a steady, hopeful heartbeat. The women of the town arrived each day with baskets of food and jugs of fresh water, their presence a quiet, constant support. The children, too, played their part, led by young Danny. They found a wide, smooth plank of wood that had been saved from the fire. With charcoal and paints made from crushed berries and clay, they carefully drew a sign. It wasn't a perfect sign. The letters were wobbly, and the drawing of a cow looked more like a horse. But the words were clear, a testament to their new reality. It read, Dry Willow School Gallery. A place for learning, and a place for seeing the truth. They presented it to Elias and Lila with a solemn pride that brought a lump to Elias's throat. One afternoon, as the new rafters of the barn were being set in place, the weekly mail coach arrived. It brought a thick, expensive-looking envelope for Lila. She opened it, her fingers, still smudged with soot, breaking the clean wax seal. It was a letter from a man named Mr. Dubois, the proprietor of the largest and most prestigious photography studio in Santa Aurelia, a bustling city on the coast. He had seen some of her work. He wrote, a series on the faces of frontier miners that had been published in an Eastern newspaper. He was impressed by her unflinching eye and raw emotional honesty. The offer was direct and stunning. He wanted to hire her as his chief portraitist. The salary he named was more money than most people in Esperanza Gulch saw in 5 years. He would provide her with a state-of-the-art studio, unlimited supplies, and access to the city's most influential clientele. It was a dream she had once scarcely dared to have. A world of stability, recognition, and artistic freedom. A world of clean hands, paved streets, and a future that wasn't dependent on the whims of the wind or the rain. A world away from the smoke and dust of Dry Willow. She read the letter twice, the heavy paper feeling strange and foreign in her hands. She looked up from the elegant, flowing script. She saw the half-repaired roof of the barn, a patchwork of old and new wood. She saw Elias, his shoulder heavily bandaged, directing the placement of a heavy beam, his voice calm and steady. She saw the children's hand-painted sign, propped against the well house. Santa Aurelia was a city of strangers. This dusty, broken place was filled with people she had fought alongside, people whose faces she knew, whose stories were now intertwined with her own. That evening, the work was done. A quiet, weary peace settled over the ranch. The smell of charred earth was still on the air, but it was mingled now with the clean scent of fresh-cut pine from the new timbers. Lila found Elias by the corral, coiling a new length of rope. The old one had been singed in the fire. He worked with his one good arm, his movements slow but precise. He looked up as she approached. He didn't ask about the letter. He had seen her reading it, had seen the complex emotions play across her face. He simply held out the new coil of rope. It was a beautiful piece of work, strong and flexible, its fibers smelling of hemp and tar. A partnership is a strong rope, he said, his voice quiet. Each strand is important. It doesn't work if one is pulling all the weight, or if one is just a shadow of the other. He looked her directly in the eye, his gaze unwavering. Stay, Lila, stay and be a partner, not a shadow. It was the most he had ever offered anyone. It was more than a proposal. It was a statement of equality, a promise of a shared load, a shared life. He wasn't asking her to be his wife, not in the traditional sense. He was asking her to be his equal, to build something with him, strand by strand. Lila took the rope. She felt its solid, reassuring weight in her hands. She looked past him, at the porch of the small ranch house, at the deep, life-giving well. She took a long, slow breath, inhaling the familiar scents of the high desert, of dry grass and horse sweat, and the faint, chemical tang of silver nitrate that always seemed to cling to her clothes. This place had a smell. It had a texture. Santa Aurelia was just a name on a piece of paper. This was real. She walked into the house, which now served as her temporary gallery and dark room. She opened her large wooden chest of photographic equipment. Her hand went to the framed glass plate, the picture of the drill site at Midnight Spire. It was her masterpiece, the photograph that had saved them. It was her ticket to Santa Aurelia. She could use it as proof of her skill, her courage. She took the plate and carefully slid it into a heavy paper envelope, along with a written deposition for Sheriff Harlan to send to the territorial marshal. It was evidence, and its place was with the law. She sealed the envelope. Then, decisively, she closed the lid of the chest. Her future was not in that box. She returned to the porch where Elias was waiting, his face unreadable in the gathering dusk. "I will stay," she said, her voice clear and bright as the evening star that had just appeared over the mountains. "On one condition, that we choose to remember, together, not just the big things, the fires and the fights, but everything, every day." Elias looked at her, his face softening. For years, his memory had been a burden, a heavy stone of grief and loss he had carried on his back. He had hoarded his dark memories, letting them define him, letting them poison his present. Lila didn't want to erase his past. She wanted to build a new one with him, a shared history, one day at a time. A slow nod was his only answer, but in that simple gesture, it was as if the great, heavy stone he had been carrying for 5 long years had finally been lifted from his back. He felt a lightness he had forgotten was possible. The ghosts of the past, the memories of Mary, of the first fire, of the drought, did not vanish, but they were no longer overwhelming. They were making room. They were stepping back to allow new memories to grow in the light. The dawn came not as a fire, but as a slow, quiet washing of pale gray light across the eastern mountains. It was a gentle dawn, the kind that promised a day of honest work, not a struggle for survival. On the blackened plains of Dry Willow, a miracle of dew had gathered overnight, each tiny droplet clinging to the strands of new barbed wire, catching the first light like a string of scattered diamonds. The land, still scarred, was breathing again. The first sounds of this new day were the sounds of life, a low, contented rumble from the small herd of cattle in the corral, a sound not of panic, but of hunger. And then, the chatter of small voices, the scuff of worn boots on the dirt path. The children were arriving for school, their faces bright, their hands, as always, dusted with the pale powder of chalk and the red powder of the earth. They ran past the barn, its roof a patchwork of old gray timber and new, honey-colored pine, and they did not look back. Nailed neatly to the front of the renovated corn crib was their sign, the wobbly letters a proud declaration, Dry Willow School Gallery. It hung straight and true, and just inside the open doorway, visible to anyone who passed, Lila had hung a new photograph on the wall. It was not the damning image of the drill site, which was now on its way to the territorial capital. This was a different kind of evidence. It was a picture of the schoolhouse, taken the night of the smoke. It was dark, a little blurry, but it captured perfectly the image of a dozen small, frightened faces, huddled together in the gloom, their eyes fixed on the single, reassuring figure of their teacher. It was not a memory of a crime. It was a memory of their survival, a testament to the night they had all been protected. Elias was working on the door of that same building. He had removed the old, heavy oak bar, the one that had caused so much trouble. In its place, he was fitting a new, simple iron bolt. The metal was cool and smooth in his hands. He worked with a quiet focus, drilling the pilot holes, setting the screws, making sure the bolt slid home with a satisfying, solid click. This was the same door he had once barred in haste and fear. Now, he was securing it with deliberation and care. It was not a barrier to keep the world out, but a lock to keep what was precious safe inside. The past was not being erased. It was being repaired, made stronger. Lila was at the well. She lowered the wooden bucket, the rope sliding smoothly through her hands, the windlass turning with a quiet, steady rhythm. The bucket hit the water with a deep, clear splash. The water level was high again, the aquifer slowly healing itself now that the illegal drilling had stopped. She drew the bucket up, its contents cool and impossibly clear. She leaned over the stone parapet, and for a moment, just watched the water settle. In the still, dark surface, 2 reflections looked back at her own, and that of the man who had just walked up to stand beside her. They were shimmering, indistinct, but they were together. She turned to him, drying her hands on her apron. From her pocket, she pulled a small, folded linen handkerchief. It was clean, but not pristine. Across one corner, there was a faint, silvery stain, a constellation of tiny, glittering specks where a drop of silver nitrate had once spilled. It was a mark of her trade, a blemish that was also a badge of honor. "For you," she said, holding it out to him. "So, you remember the day we chose the light?" He looked at the small cloth, at the way the morning sun made the silver specks sparkle. He understood. The light she spoke of was not just the flash that had captured the truth in the canyon. It was the light of honesty, the light that had driven the shadows from the church, the light that was now filling their valley. He took the handkerchief. His left wrist, where he had braced himself against the falling ladder, was a dark, bruised purple. Slowly, deliberately, he wrapped the soft linen around the injury. It was not a bandage to heal the wound, but a promise to remember its cause. He was binding her symbol of truth to his own pain, his own sacrifice. His other hand, the strong, uninjured one, reached out and found hers. His calloused fingers closed around her cool, smooth ones. They did not need to grip or squeeze. It was a quiet, solid fit, two different hands that had learned to do the same work. He stood there, a silent man on a quiet morning, with a woman's promise wrapped around his wrist and her hand held firmly in his. Lila looked up at his face, at the lines of weariness that were now softened by something new. Something that looked like peace. "You'll remember this," she smiled. The words were the same ones she had spoken in the smoky darkness of the corn crib and in the crimson glow of the dark room. But the meaning had changed. It was no longer a challenge or a statement of fact. It was a gentle invitation. It was a shared promise. He leaned down, and she rose to meet him. They kissed. It was not the desperate, passionate kiss of a storybook romance. It was a kiss that tasted of well water and wood smoke, of coffee and the clean morning air. It was a quiet, certain kiss, a promise not of ease, but of endurance. It was a promise of shared labor, of rising with the sun and facing whatever the day might bring. Together, around them, the world did not stop. The lowing of the cattle continued, a reminder of the chores that waited. From the schoolhouse, they could hear the faint, rhythmic scrape of chalk on a slate, the sound of a future being written, one letter at a time. A horse snorted softly in the corral. No one in town saw it. No one whispered. No one turned it into a story to be passed over a fence post or a saloon bar. The time for rumors was over. The people of Esperanza Gulch were too busy. They were busy rebuilding, replanting, and raising their children. They were busy living their own lives. High above the valley, the last of the night's red dust, stirred up by the fire and the wind, finally settled back to earth. The air was clear, and in the quiet heart of Dry Willow, a new memory stood firm and unshakable. It was the memory of a door, once locked in fear, now secured in love. It was the memory of a smile, not of a curse that had opened the door to a whole new life. Thank you for listening to our story. We'd love to know where you're tuning in from, so please drop a comment below to say hello and share your thoughts. If you enjoyed this tale, please consider subscribing to our channel, Wild West Stories 1850. Give this video a like and hit that hype button to help share it with more listeners like you.